Right. Yeah. Good enough. I'm gonna call it good enough. I like this handout. Hey, good. So how many sets of cards are you carrying around? Well, I brought 5 with me to this event, and I'm only taking home. I'm only taking home 3. That's less. So that's yeah. It's always hard to predict, right? Like you don't know. You know what I mean? Yeah. And you're headed back? I am. I'm gonna get on the bus at 3 o'clock. I want to see here for lunch first. Yeah. Anyway, I appreciate it. So glad that you got to participate. Yeah, and really are. You know what I mean? Like there's something about if you can structure an encounter, like it brings out the. It's like how do we structure an encounter to bring out the goodness, right? The care and yeah, and go a little deeper. Where you're from or something. You're gonna be around doing lunch a little bit, and yeah, how about I'll walk out with you if you want. Look, you're my conference buddy. Yeah, I'll walk out with you over there. None of that's mine. That was all here. Over here that is mine is this. Out here. Yes, I am. Windows on here. I'm not just wasn't used to seeing it.
Yeah, that
We
pop
do have
up
people
there.
that like to do that.
Oh yeah, the sound. Okay. That's gonna work. We just have to we just get through the slide.
Good night, Kathy. See you tomorrow.
Good night, darling. Take care of that throat. You're a big singing star now, remember? This California dew is just a little heavier than usual tonight.
Really? From where I stand, the sun is shining all over the place.
My office is right next door. Anyone struggling, I'll run over.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll just set up right before. Good to go. Oh, good.
It's right here,
there.
and you just plug it into
Yeah,
your
right,
USB.
right.
If it pops up with a thing, board setup, whatever, just plug. This is either going to be right here next to you, or it's going to be plugged in right here.
Okay.
Just take it out.
Forward is here,
Yep.
backwards.
Backward laser pointer.
Oh, yeah. All right. I will, have any question.
Come and see me, or I'll come and see you.
All right.
Testing on his computer for later. Can you see the second zone? Or three? I'll be on there. I got name tag. You want us to test this call real quick? He's already on.
And then you can start setting up. Set up my laptop?
Yes.
And we can run your test. Mr. Rushkoff, can you hear me?
Hey, I can hear you.
Can you hear me okay?
Uh-huh.
Okay, great. We can hear you.
Yeah.
So we're just doing kind of some audio testing right now. So just
Yeah.
keep talking and so we can adjust our levels.
Okie doke. My name is Douglas. I'm in New York. I can share my screen like that. What happens when I do that? Oh, you
Yes.
see that in blue. That's interesting. And they can probably in the booth make that blue be me if they really wanted. Right?
Yes.
I don't know.
You are live right now in the room. So there's people coming in and out.
Yeah.
But we can see your slides or your graph.
Yeah. And there's me.
And we see you.
Beautiful.
And this is Janet.
Hey.
Hey, hey, how are
Hey.
you?
Swimming through the rapids.
Hang in there, and we're really
Yeah.
glad you're going to be here in this way.
Yeah, it's life. Such is life.
Such is life. True.
Yeah. You look good and energetic.
So, yeah, just so you know, you are live and everyone can hear and see you. And we are going to test Gabriella's slides because she also has one and a video. So just hang tight and we'll get started in a couple minutes.
Great. Do you know what order we're going in?
I think you're first. So we
Okey-doke.
have a moderator that's going to introduce you, and she'll kind of signal to you to start talking.
Cool.
Okay, hang tight.
All right.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did it work? Well, whatever. Do we want to test audio? Is there audio on your video, Gabriella?
Yes.
I feel like we should run a test just because sometimes it's.
Yeah, I'm gonna use this because it'll be. Actually, we can use this too, but you were using the VGA, which is.
uh, an anthropologist who is an expert on human bones, specifically on the trauma. Well, I
I'm gonna show you real quick right here. That's all you need to do. It's flashing when it's blanked, and if you click it again, it'll unblank. All is good to go with the call. All that I'm doing, I'm pressing this, and I'll be right next door. So walk around.
Jer,
Yeah.
I see you. I see you.
Doug, what's up, man? How you feeling, bro?
You think I'm coming through the audio, but I'm actually in your head. No one else can hear me but you, man.
Oh, this is great. Hey, I just want you to know we all send you our best wishes and blessings on the health and healing of your whole family. And just want you to know
Thank you.
that everyone here is really on your side. And we're just so grateful to have you here participating with us, even in color.
Love you.
Love you too, really. Should I bring other folks in? Yes, no. Yeah.
I'm crazy.
Doug, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, we're going to start in just a moment. We're giving people a couple of more minutes to get their lunch and get on in here, and then we'll start up. I'm Julie Newton. I'm glad to meet you.
Hey, good to meet you too.
Can you see me?
Yeah, kinda. Not enough to
Kinda?
recognize you. Yeah. Yeah.
I guess that's the camera back there.
Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha. All righty. So, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've had an opportunity to get some lunch and be ready for a rousing discussion here by two star presenters. Our first presenter is Douglas Rushkoff, and he was named by MIT as one of the world's 10 most influential intellectuals. We have the opportunity to intellectualize with him this afternoon. As you know, he's a media theorist, documentarian, specialist in human autonomy in a digital age. And I think I will go right to turn the program over to him. And second, we will have Dr. Gabriela Martinez, who is an international award-winning documentarian and theorist, and I'll tell you more about her in a little bit. So, Doug Rushkoff.
Great. Hi. So I'll do. Oh, thanks. Like 20 or 25 minutes is what I was told. So I'm going to try to jam what's become my life's work into there. But I guess we're all used to doing that. The gist of what I want to say is that we're currently programming the digital economy for industrialism. And that means to take humans out of the business equation and extract value from life. And then perpetrators really want to then just insulate themselves from reality using the money they've won, or worst case, build a rocket ship and get away from the damage they've left behind. And what I'm offering is that we could instead retrieve some pre-industrial, human-scaled, and pardon the term, pro-life mechanisms, and instead build a distributed economy. And the moment that this became really clear, and that's why I always use the image, I used it even as the title of this book, was in around November and December of 2013, when people started to lie down in front of the buses that Google was using to ferry its employees from San Francisco to Mountain View, the company headquarters, because it seemed that that was a perfect case study and example of the way a large company, a company that started as the good guys, really, two kids in a Stanford dorm room coming up with an algorithm to take down Yahoo, which was the big bad corporate player at that time, by using peer-to-peer links instead of top-down organization to help us search the net, that this company had, for various reasons, grown to a size where now its employees were changing the economy of San Francisco. And they weren't even working in San Francisco. This was a company that was almost an hour away, but everyone wants almost the Hollywood backdrop of San Francisco if they're going to be there. So here was Google meaning to do well for the environment and cut down on individual commuters, but actually really just wanting to have another hour or two of work per day from their employees in an air-conditioned Wi-Fi bus, using public bus stops to ferry its private employees from a town that it was in many ways destroying, because as more and more programmers lived there, the rents went up, and the people who had been living there for 10, 20, 30 years, small businesses and bodegas and Mexican restaurants, they were all going out of business as the rent went higher. So really what we were looking at was how the growth of a company was destroying the physical environment, the actual ecology in which that company was operating. It was extracting value and really delivering it to distant shareholders while destroying its local community. And that, for me, became a great, not just a great metaphor, but a great example of the way really capital and value have become disconnected. The corporations really in America, and pretty much worldwide, but mostly in America, they've been really over the last 75 years at this point, the amount of profit corporations can make is shrinking relative to their size. What that really means is that corporations are growing bigger by taking all the money off the table, but they're getting worse and worse at deploying the assets that they've taken. So they really, what they're about now is extracting value from people and places in order to convert it into really an abstracted form of capital that's of no use to the people in the real world. And for me, it harkens back to the three original factors of production, which are land, labor, and capital. And in a digital economy, the only one of these three factors of production that can survive is capital, because only capital scales. That's really what every venture capitalist and every digital business plan is about, is how are we going to scale this business? And when I hear the word scale at this point, what that means to me is how are we going to make this non-natural, non-human, non-lifelike, really, and into some bizarre, abstracted, out-of-scale thing. So I really wanted to figure out how had we gotten in this position? How had we gotten in a place where companies are at this point really incapable of creating value, incapable of deploying their assets. Even a company like Google realizes that they can't make money as a technology company. That's why they converted themselves into what's now called Alphabet. Alphabet's a holding company. It's a company that makes its money by buying and selling technology companies. So even it abstracted. It became a meta company in order to scale in a way that would work for it. And of course, as it does so, it just really leaves more and more human and natural, devastation in its wake. And the reason why this is happening is because, and it's ironic, is that these venture capitalists and technologists are ignorant of the operating system on which their companies are running. They're very aware of Python and Java and Mac and PC and any scripting language and machine language, but they're oblivious to the fact that their capital is being raised on a program that was written by people at a particular moment in history and have long since left the building. So in order to figure out, where this came from, I did my, economic history research. And what I found out was that it was really shortly after the Crusades that we had the beginnings of a kind of a velocity-based, human-scaled economy. We saw the former peasants of the peasants of feudalism beginning to create value and trade value. And that's because the soldiers came back from the Crusades. They had opened up new trade routes throughout the world that weren't open before. And they also brought back with them many mechanisms, both mechanisms for harvesting grain and crushing, using different kinds of mills and technologies, but also new financial technologies. So what emerged in the late Middle Ages in Europe after the Crusades was the marketplace. They had markets before, but they were mostly barter markets where, I trade my chicken to you for your wheat. Now what they had were new kinds of currency that they brought with them. And they didn't actually bring the money. They brought the mechanisms. They brought the recipes for these currencies. And these were really market monies that were hatched in the morning and expired by night. These were monies like poker chips in a poker game. I mean, you could, read about them. We could talk about how they work later. But the interesting thing about them was that they were optimized for trade. They were optimized for the velocity of transactions. They weren't capital. They weren't investment that you could put in and get out. They didn't have interest. If anything, they lost value over time. And that was another way of encouraging their momentum, encouraging their velocity. And people in the late Middle Ages, they ended up doing really well. It was one of the best organic growth periods we've ever seen economically, where people were working 3 and 4 days a week. Women were taller in medieval Europe than they were at any time until around 1970s in England. So they were, not that it was a great time. You still, people threw rocks and did terrible things and burned witches and, but economically, there was a new kind of growth that was exciting. The problem was the aristocracy got poor as the former peasants became the bourgeois, became the burghers. So the aristocracy came up with really two mechanisms to quell the rise of the merchant class, to slow down this growing velocity-based economy. The first was the chartered monopoly or the proto-corporation. And we know that the chartered monopoly most simply made it so that you could no longer work in an industry as an independent business. You had to now work for one of the chartered monopolies. You had to become an employee. So instead of, if you were a shoemaker, instead of making a shoe and selling the value you created, now you had to work as an employee of the shoe company. And the shoe company, of course, is not looking for the most skilled shoemakers. They're looking for the equivalent of the Home Depot parking lot where they can find an unregistered alien to come in and work for 2 cents an hour. So the industrial processes that they came up with really were not about making things faster or better. The industrial age processes were about using less expensive labor and more expendable labor. Again, removing human beings from the equation. The second thing they came up with was central currency. They made all of these market monies, all of the local currencies illegal, and came up with central currency, which meant that now if you wanted to transact, you had to borrow money from the central treasury at interest, which is really interesting. If you have to borrow money from the central treasury at interest, then that means now growth is built into the economy. In order for the economy to stay still even, more money has to be paid back to the lenders than they lent out. So where does that more money come from? It comes from expansion. It comes from extraction. Now, this worked well enough in the colonial ages because the chartered monopolies, the East India Trading Company, were going to America, going to Africa. I mean, as long as you're not worried about the people being enslaved or the resources that are being stolen, as a business plan, as a colonial expansionary business plan, it worked. But it was not circulatory, it was extractive. And it was not genuinely competitive, it was monopolistic. So I made this little chart to kind of show how we moved from one economy to another. And you can see that the artisanal economy that is that first column, that's what I was trying to describe, that was happening in these marketplaces where we have a subsistence economy based family businesses using market money, people doing direct investment, trading handmade things, and it goes along with the manuscript era. People were trading with a human face. It was a peer-to-peer interactions with personal contact. Resources were managed in a commons, not perfectly because it was church controlled, but it was still the notion of a governed commons was commonplace. People understood it. People were paid for value rather than their time. The scale of this economy was local, and it was optimized for the creation of value, or even in some cases, the exchange of value. But then that was forcibly moved really through laws, through charters, to this industrial economy, where instead of subsistence, we're looking toward growth. We have chartered monopolies instead of family businesses, central currencies instead of market monies, stock markets instead of direct investment. We have mass production. We have brand icons replacing the human face. And now you've got, the Quaker oatmeal, the Quaker guy on your oatmeal instead of Joe the oat seller. You've got a brand icon. You're using mass media to spread these images rather than personal contact. Where we're using land, really, we're looking at land more as something to colonize than something to share. People are paid for their time, really, which hadn't been done really since slavery. And the scale really moved from local, or even the city-state, moved to the nation-state, which again is an abstraction. The nation-state is not a natural collection of humans. And the currency itself then is optimized for the extraction of value. So that, in my mind, of course, it was not just icky, but it was dehumanizing. Colonialism, promoted slavery, the use of land as territory, and the media of the time. If you look at something like the Great Exhibition that was done well, I guess it was Prince Albert really who did the Great Exhibition in Victorian England. What they were celebrating was a British dominion over the world, but what they brought back were not people and customs from the world. What they showed at the Great Exhibition were the mechanical weaving looms, not the people. There weren't human beings operating them. There was just the giant machines, as if to say, you don't need the humans. And what this led to was a business model that was always about killing ecosystems, killing communities in order to extract value, whether it's the East India Company or Walmart. There's a form of colonialism going on where you know how a Walmart will move into a community, it will sell items at below cost using its immense capital, of course. It'll sell items below cost to put everyone else out of business. So they're the sole employer as well as the sole provider in town. If they're the sole employer, they can hire people part-time. They'll make subsistence or not even subsistence wages. They'll have to go on welfare. And a Walmart can last really 20 or 25 years in a community before it bankrupts the community, closes up shop, and then moves on to another one. So it's the same as British East India Trading Company going to an island and enslaving the people or not letting them provide value, internalizing all the value creation and externalizing all of the problems. And this really worked globally. It worked right up until around World War II and Eisenhower time, when those countries and colonies started to push back. And Eisenhower had, interestingly enough, if you read, Vannevar Bush's work or other sort of 1950s technologists who were writing at the time, what they were really saying was, don't worry, technology will create new surface area on the markets. There's a new thing to colonize, whether it's human time or human attention. Don't worry, the economy will still be able to grow forever somehow. And what they really looked at technology doing at that point in order to extend this industrial model was to, of course, increase the surface area of the consumer, to automate labor, and then externalize the costs of this supposed efficiency. When you automate labor, it doesn't actually make things more efficient for the whole ecosystem. It just makes things more efficient for you. So if you have a company, if you want to fire your human receptionist and replace him or her with a computer receptionist, yes, it's cheaper for your company, but everybody who calls your company is now spending all of this time going through menus and fighting through things. So what you've done is you've externalized the cost, but everyone's actually spending more time and energy. It's just a super simple example of how that works. So then digital technology actually got in the hands of people. And that's when we thought, oh, this could be interesting. Now we can maybe retrieve some of that original peer-to-peer, Etsy, Burning Man, medieval-like interesting economy that we had before. And it was exciting, and people were actually building things, making stuff, shareware, everything was free. The problem with the internet was in 1994, the media companies did a survey and found out that the average internet-connected home was watching 9 hours less commercial television per week. And those, oh my God, crisis. So along came Wired. And Wired magazine came along to recontextualize digital as not as the replacement of the corporatocracy, but as a new era, a new era for the corporatocracy. Wired positioned itself as revolutionary, but it was actually reactionary. What Wired was saying is, don't worry, there is an investment opportunity here. We are going to have what we will call a long boom, which means now that we have digital technology, the stock market can grow and expand infinitely forever, just like the universe. And that's what got us to the place where we can look at a company like Twitter, and Trump aside, we can call Twitter a failure, even though it makes $2 billion a year. And that's because of the amount of investment that's gone in. It turns out that all you can make off a 140-character messaging app is about $2 billion a year. To me, that would be 140-character messaging app makes $2 billion a year. Let's stop right there. This is good. Let's ride this one out. But no, it's considered an abject failure because it's not growing, and it has to grow. And there's this idea that it came along with digital plus industrialism that everything has to grow forever. And that's even justified using natural imagery, using Darwinian logic, and that's insane, right? That doesn't work. Things don't have to grow forever. The coral reef didn't have, well, maybe in this environment it did because now it's almost gone. But no, a living organism doesn't keep growing forever. It actually reaches a sustainable equilibrium. It reaches a carrying capacity, and that it circulates rather than keep growing. So what we ended up getting, though, in Amazon and Uber are digitally amplified versions of Walmart and the British East India Trading Company. When Amazon decides to go into books or Uber decides to go into cabs, they're not going into it because they're thinking, oh, we're going to make the book industry better. Oh, we're going to help people and cab drivers and everybody and help the cab industry. No, they're looking at low-hanging fruit. They're looking at industries that they can dominate completely in order to establish monopolies, the same as the old chartered monopolies, except instead of using law, they're going to use programming to establish their monopolies. And then once you have that monopoly, pivot from that monopoly into another vertical. Right? So there's no intention of staying in cabs. There's no intention of staying in books. Amazon is not a book company. It's a server company. It's something else. And so that's why then we got to this, the third line in this little column here, or third column here, is instead of retrieving these medieval mechanisms, we did digital industrialism. So we look for exponential growth. Instead of having chartered monopolies, we develop platform monopolies like Amazon. Our currency moves from regular currency now to derivative instruments. The derivatives are actually bigger than shares. You know, the New York Stock Exchange was actually purchased by its derivatives exchange, and that's because derivatives can compress so much more value into the same period of time. But when you think about it, the stock market, which was already an abstraction of the market, was now consumed by its own abstraction. Right? That's what happens when you scale infinitely. So then we have, I mean, you can see the rest of the column. We get down to things like, like big data, which is what we do. If once people have no more money to spend, well, at least they've got data they can give. And once people are giving data, the problem is what happens is you end up reducing your own spontaneity. That's really what data is. It's not life. It's something very different. So when Facebook uses your past behavior to market to you a future that you don't yet know you're going to live, what they're really doing is trying to limit your spontaneity, to get you, if there's an 80% chance of you going on a diet in the next 3 weeks, they're going to fill your news feed with the stuff that gets that up to 90% or 95%, because in their business model is to demonstrate that they can predict your choices. So we end up in a world where software is really converting the value of the living world into a share price of a dead one. We're moving from kinetic circulatory energy to potential energy that's stored not as muscle, but stored as fat. And the real answer, of course, is to retrieve these mechanisms of the medieval market. And that's what this last column is trying to sort of dream forward, where instead of optimizing for extraction, we optimize for velocity, and instead of optimizing for growth, we start thinking about flow. And it's what I started to call digital distributism, using digital, of course, for this age, and distributism, which came really from the Catholic Church. When they were asked to decide between Marxism and capitalism, they said distributism. And what they really meant was, instead of redistributing the spoils of capitalism after the fact, let's pre-distribute the means of production before the fact. And the best way of doing that I've seen so far, the best sort of language around that, is what we're calling the platform cooperative. So imagine if Uber, instead of being a platform monopoly, what if Uber were owned by the drivers? So then, even if they are just doing research and development for the robot cars that are going to replace them, now they own that company. A platform cooperative is really just a platform that is owned by the people who use it, owned by the people who work on it. So the platform becomes something more like a commons, or even even a co-op. And it returns to a kind of a localism or urbanism. It's commons-based, and you can't externalize because there's no one to externalize to, because all of the stakeholders are stakeholders. So it ends up being run more like a family business. And the alternative now really is Silicon Valley's intentional obsolescence of human beings, where the billionaires get to escape and the rest of us go down with the planet. And they would say, why not? Because humans are the problem. If they studied with Girard at Stanford, it was Peter Thiel's teacher. They've got Kurzweil at Google, who thinks that the singularity is a great thing because finally humans will be humans could be swept away by computers, which are superior. And if they really understood digital, they would understand that these are the digits. The original digits are people. They come from life, not from death. That digital is the retrieval of the human factor, the retrieval of production. The platform co-op really as a political economy, which is really what we wanted to talk about today, it restores solidarity, not against management like an old style labor union, but really for cooperation. The models for a platform co-op do come from light, from the coral reef, from the rainforest, from the rhizome, which are not required to grow in order to live, but simply to circulate and renew. So what I'm out there propagandizing really is that we should use technology to not to optimize life for an obsolete market model, but rather to use technology to optimize the market for life. Okay, thanks very much.
Wow. Okay, then. Let's have a few questions for Doug Rushkoff right now while we have him on the screen before we go on to Dr. Martinez. So, surely you have some questions.
Or you can email me at rushkoff@rushkoff.com.
Okay.
Fritjof Capra, thank you very much for this brilliant presentation. I loved it. I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't know about your work before, and so I have two questions. What can I read which contains what you just said? Question one. And number two is, do you know the book by Marjorie Kelly, Owning Our Future? Because she talks about a generative ownership design rather than an extractive ownership design in terms of co-ops and things like that. And it seems to dovetail with what you're saying.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I'm familiar with her work, and the people that helped develop this platform cooperative model are familiar with her work and are. They like most of it. They've got some issues with some of the way the focus on ownership is tricky, because it's not all stakeholders are necessarily owners. So there was some issue with that, but yeah, familiar with that very much. I mean, the thing I'm talking about now would be the book I just did called Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus. The book that's more inspired by your work, which, I mean, you the man, was no, I mean, really, I wouldn't have started on the whole path without, originally, Dow physics, but God, would be Present Shock, which really looks at what's the human experience in this. So, Present Shock includes some talk of this market phenomenon, but is really what happens to the human organism and human society when we are being atomized this way by our technologies, and that our technologies, which were really so much about connecting people to other people, have been used to do the opposite, and that's largely a market phenomenon. But Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus is the one that really looks at business after business and why they have this really anti-organismic quality to them. How we went from really how we got into that the way General Electric was, say, in the 1990s, where they realized, this guy Jack Welch, that, oh my gosh, I make less money building and selling a washing machine than I do lending money to someone to buy that washing machine. So I'm going to sell off all my actual value creating businesses, all the appliance business, sell those off and just go into finance, because they just realized that an abstract business can scale infinitely, and it worked until around 2007. So Google, the Google Bus book really looks at that, whereas the Present Shock book looks more at a wider array of forces that are kind of throwing us into this state of shock as individuals and a culture.
Hi. Thanks for your summary. I think, I mean, this is a really crash course on, Western capitalism. I just have a question. So it seems that there is always a romantic thinking about pre-industrial society.
Mm-hmm.
That people lived and work happily together. They plant the things that they would eat, blah blah. And also, I think there is the same romantic thinking about platform economy that I mean, we will just build things that are useful and enjoy them. So if you look at open source movement, 98% of the developers are white middle class males from developed countries. So, women, minorities, not talking about people who don't even have internet connection, I mean, they're being left out. So, you mentioned about the undocumented immigrant worker waiting outside in the parking lot. How are you going to convince that person to not work for $1 an hour, but instead to join a platform economy?
Well, I don't know that the Home Depot parking lot is the best starting place. I mean, there's a lot of factors. There's a lot of factors at play influencing that space. The way, if it wouldn't be hard to convince a Uber driver to join. I mean, so in New York, many Uber drivers are joining a company called Juno, where they get to own the company rather than just be a whatever that is, an unpaid freelancer, hack for the company. So it's I don't know that I even that I would go to the necessarily the most disenfranchised workers first, but where I'm seeing the most success is where companies that are going bankrupt using the current model need to pivot, and sometimes they're willing to. The owners are willing to surrender the company to the workers, who then take it over and reconfigure it as a cooperative. And once they do, there's all sorts of new possibilities. Or, I mean, I don't know if they're in Oregon, but a company like Winco, which is in many ways no better than a Walmart, except for the fact that it's employee owned. The employees are paid more. They have shares in the company. Consumers prefer the stores. They do less damage to their communities because the owners are people who live in those communities. And when a shareholder of Walmart asked me how can this company do that? How can they pay their workers more and give them shares of the company and charge the same low prices that Walmart does? And the simple answer is, well, because they don't have you, because they don't have to pay all this money to a long distance shareholder. And while I'm not trying to romanticize the late Middle Ages, I don't think I would have lived very long there. So I'm glad we're not there, but I do believe that when we have a Renaissance moment such as ours, there's an opportunity to retrieve mechanisms that were forcibly repressed by the monarchs the last time out. And things like local currency, like guilds, like certain kinds of cooperatives and commons were forcibly repressed. They didn't just get outmoded. They were ended at knife point or sword point. King Philip called out the Knights Templar to quash the local and market monies that were threatening his monopoly currency in whenever that 1100 or 1200. So no, it's not perfect, but I certainly think that there are valuable mechanisms that we can bring back and deploy here. No, it's not going to be easy, but and to in some ways agree with you and counter what I just said. The most successful, long-lived cooperatives are in precisely the places where we're saying it would be so difficult. You go to Philadelphia, you go to the inner city. African Americans, Hispanic Americans, they're the ones who've had cooperatives. They're the ones who've had to do that in order to survive in rough times. I mean, talk to Esteban Kelly. Go to Philadelphia. Go to the south of Dallas, and you'll see the places that the regular industrial economy has given up on have had to do certain things in order to survive, and a lot of them are more advanced forms of platform cooperative than most of us in the academic elite who are espousing these ideas can even imagine.
Just a quick question. Are you in conversation with Gar Elperwitz and his communitywealth.org?
I'm not.
Democracy? Okay, so Gar Elperwitz has put together a substantial, it's an online and organizational presence, which is all about community wealth building from how-tos on how to build co-ops, how to do employee stock ownership programs, et cetera, et cetera. So it's this really powerful kind of grounded action that's trying to both inform and share kinds of information that sound like what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so that was one thing I was just wondering. The other was, I was wondering if you were in touch with or in conversation with Benjamin Barber, Mr. Strong Democracy, who now these days is putting together this international initiative called the Global Parliament of Mayors. Where the idea being that many of the ideas you're talking about, that if they're going to get traction, these things are most likely not going to happen from the top down. They're going to come up from the communities, and cities may be the place to start.
Yeah, I mean, I'm getting invited to a lot of conferences to talk about the city, and this moment where the city-state gave way to the nation-state. I don't feel like it's coincidental that that's the moment that local currencies gave way to extractive ones, or that small businesses gave way to corporate charters, or that we've got the invention of the giant chartered monopolies. So no, I definitely. I mean, and in all honesty, I mean, I'm a writer and a thinker more than a new economic activist. What I saw in, it's interesting. As I was writing this book, I was sure that, oh my God, this is the only thing that matters, because the economy is the thing that's killing the that's killing the environment. And if we can get off growth-based economics, then we don't have to destroy the planet. I started reading John Stuart Mill and looking at the carrying capacity of an economy, and how can you reach that, and how can you convince people of that. But in all honesty, I'm a writer more than I am an activist. So I'm collecting names and writing pieces, but I take heart at the fact that there are the New Economic Coalition, and there's Shareable, and there are a lot of places where these ideas are being discussed in greater depth than I do. So I can talk about it from a cultural, sociological, media perspective, but luckily, in the year or two since this book came out, there are people who are boots on the ground doing a whole lot more. So I can still cheerlead and argue and explain, and help give some perspective on how we've gotten here, and hopefully argue to Silicon Valley why they would make more money through circulatory models, or certainly higher probability of making more money through a circulatory model than chasing a 1 out of a billion shot unicorn. But yeah, I wouldn't want to give you the idea that because I've talked about this that I'm the guy who's out there building these networks. They exist, and they're there, and I can help you find them, but I'm certainly not it.
Okay, I want to close out with one last question. It's been enjoyable to hear you play with the McLuhan's tetrad, and I know, you won the Marshall McLuhan